Have you experienced the awesome power of the Panasonic Real 3DO system? Obviously.
Presenting 3DO, the most advanced home gaming system in the universe. It's time to put away your toys.
3DO from Panasonic, Gold Star, and Creative Labs. A new low price and free games.
Mind-blowing graphics of Panasonic Real 3DO.
3DO.
Hey guys, and welcome back to the 3DO Experience. It is a gaming retrospective podcast where we discuss the ill-fated 3DO interactive multiplayer system and the company behind it. So for this episode, I actually have a guest with me for the first time. Introduce yourself.
Hello, my name's Josh Koval. I'm the host of the Still Loading podcast, and I am so excited to be on here today to talk about the 3DO, not because I have any unique perspective, but because I like game history and I like consoles that make no sense to exist, though it did make sense at the time. I within the context of the early 90s, this console made a whole lot of sense to exist. But it's kind of funny now, obviously, with the retrospect, and I'm so excited that you're doing this series because like you were saying in the intro episode, like not a lot of people talk about this console, and I really feel it needs its documentation. It needs its place in gaming history because it did do some things that were interesting. And I guess real quick about the Still Loading podcast. Still Loading podcast is a video game podcast that is focusing on video game culture, history, and everything else in between around it. So I have done episodes that are deep dives into specific games. At the time of this recording, my most recent episode was on Pikmin that just came out a couple days ago. But then I also do weird things, right? Weird episode ideas like the Final Fantasy draft, where what if you take fantasy sports and Final Fantasy and mash them together? You get the Final Fantasy draft. And of course, I do some interviews with cool people in the industry. I've had on voice actors like David Kay and Sissy Jones. I've had on composers like Austin Wintory, and I've had on game designers. I actually had probably in terms of video game history, something that might be of interest to the listeners here, I had on Warren Davis, the creator of Qbert, which he was very fun and very nice to talk to. So yeah, Still Loading podcast. It covers a little bit of everything, modern, retro, and everything in between.
Nice. All right. So anyways, as I stated in the previous episode, my whole goal with this whole entire podcast, I want to discuss the history of 3DO, the company behind it, and what happened after the console inevitably failed, along with discussing all the various games that released for the system over its short lifespan. For this episode, my goal was we're going to talk the early history of the 3DO company itself, like the formation and the lead up to the release of what would eventually become the 3DO interactive multiplayer system. So I guess if we're going to start anywhere, we should probably start with the earliest days of the formation. And I guess the 3DO itself was founded, for 3DO company, I should say, was founded September 12th, 1991, almost 30 years ago. And it was founded by former EA founder Trip Hawkins.
What a name, man. Like, seriously, what a name. Like, whenever I hear that name, it just... Oh, actually, apparently his real first name is William, but he goes by Trip. Just still, what a name. Now, first thing that stands out to me about this guy, one, besides the fact that he's had his hands in a lot of amazing parts of video game history, if you go to his Wikipedia page, look at the pictures they have for him. They have one from 2019 and one from 1987. Every single one of these, and this is not indicative of the man. I've heard he's a very nice man, but every single one of these pictures makes him look like he's a villain in an 80s action movie. Especially the 2019 one with the slick back hair. He actually looks like the bad guy specifically. This is going to be a hyper specific reference. He looks like the bad guy from Jackie Chan's movie, Mr. Nice Guy. He looks like the bad guy from that movie. Have you seen that movie, Bill?
It's been a while, but I haven't. I totally agree.
Exactly what I'm talking about, right? He looks exactly like him.
The funniest thing is, in context, he was the founder of EA, and a lot of people would consider him a villain for that. So
EA back then, at least, was good. Their whole intention was to give artists the credit. They were calling themselves electronic artists. They were trying to make a name for themselves and be taken seriously. The second picture though that they have of him from '87, he kind of looks like the '80s business guy from Futurama, sort of. If you know that reference at all,
Yeah.
um, it makes me smile. He, like I said, I've heard he's a really nice guy, but the pictures of these, just he looks like a bad guy from some '80s action movie, and it makes me smile every time I look at it.
So
But yeah.
not to spoil because this was mentioned in a future episode, but he did have one infamous moment where he wasn't the nicest dude in the world, but that's for way down the line towards like the end
Well,
of the
I'm
three.
excited to hear about it. I will not read ahead. I will not read ahead on the syllabus and see what's going on. I'm excited to learn about it in your future episodes.
Mm-hmm. And do you know where the whole 3DO name comes from?
That I actually, I should have read that. No, I do not.
So I don't know if this is the exact way that they described it, but the whole idea was the 3DO was like the first console built around polygons, so 3D,
Hmm.
and then
Okay.
the idea was to be a video standard, so 3DO.
Yes. That the standard I knew. I did not know. How does the O signify a standard?
Well, it was supposed to kind of be like video, like so
Oh,
3DO.
if
Yeah.
you could see it, listeners, I'm face palming a little hard now. I get it now, and that makes sense because he was trying to go after like what it specifically cited. He had VHS and Beta as like kind of an inspiration for
Yes.
what this was going to be. He wanted 3D, like you said, 3D to be a standard.
Yes.
Because like one of the things is also like it, because it's a standard and he wouldn't have to do any of the manufacturing costs, or the 3DO company wouldn't. They would charge less royalties to the developers and the
Yes.
publishers of software and games on the platform.
It was like an absurdly low number too. It was like $3,
Yeah.
I think, per game, which at the time that sounded probably really good, especially with the more draconian policies Nintendo and Sega had at the time.
I mean, that sounds good now if that existed. I mean, there's no
I know.
way. I mean, freaking like iPhones and Androids, they charge so, what was it? It was 20% of
Hmm.
there was a 20% commission pretty much, or not commission, but a 20% take of all sales on their stores, which is nuts. And only recently has that started to drop because of all the lawsuits going on. But it's so $3 for a license in this is fantastic. I can't believe that it. I mean, especially back then, $3 goes a lot more now. Like, adjust that for inflation, it's a little bit more, but still.
Hmm. And I guess like they call it the razor and blades like mentality, where it's like you don't make money off the razor, you make money off the blades.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, No, and I like the overall idea of what the 3DO was supposed to be. It's interesting that this whole idea of creating a standard instead of like like using a game console as a standard, I found really interesting. I mean, it's kind of like what Android operating systems are for a lot of smartphones. They
Hmm.
use the Android. It's in the same thing with like the Windows operating system. But what's weird about the 3DO, like, was a 3DO was hardware specs and an operating system, not just an operating system, right?
So essentially, what it was the idea was that they would design like the specifications of what the
Hmm.
console was supposed to be, and then they would license that out to whoever wanted to make one, and then they would go
Okay,
from there to design everything else around it.
I
And I guess
getcha. I getcha.
going from there, we should probably talk about the people actually behind the system itself. So the 3DO console itself is a pretty interesting system because for the time, it was actually arguably the most powerful system on the market, depending on who
Mm-hmm.
you asked, obviously. Because it was a 32-bit system,
Less
which
processing, bro.
hey, I mean that was technically true.
And I know it is. It's good marketing. But sorry, go on.
So, anyways, 3DO was a 32-bit console, and this was still during the height of like the bit wars. Because if you
Mm-hmm.
remember, the Atari Jaguar commercial actually specifically cited the 3DO when they were talking about the bits and adding up to the 64. But
That's so strange that the Atari Jaguar commercials, like their marketing reference to 3DO, because two people who worked on the 3DO, RJ Michael and Dave Needle, helped create the Atari Lynx.
yes, they were originally Amiga engineers, I believe. I believe
Yes.
R.J. Michael was actually the creator of the Amiga software to begin with.
RJ Michael has done a ton in like tech and the game industry. One of the craziest things I think I've seen on, like, like you said, he started with Amiga, he created the Atari Lynx, and he worked on 3DO, but he also was the chief architect at this company called Fathhammer, which was a
Hmm.
mobile game engine. They developed a lot of cell phone games, and he developed the Fathhammer mobile game engine. And one of the things they developed for was the ill-fated, another obscure console that didn't last very long, the Gizmondo.
Oh boy.
What a connection! So this dude, RJ Michael, had a major hand in both the 3DO and maybe not in the creation of the Gizmondo, but at least in the development of some software for the Gizmondo. That's still wild to me that he's connected to both of them.
A little off topic, but getting into the Gizmondo, that is a wild story if you've ever had one before.
Yes, it is. Didn't someone did a documentary about, like, a YouTube documentary about it recently, like where they investigated like everything that went down with it. It's wild.
Yeah, it's actually the last off-topic thing, but the funniest thing I've ever seen the Gizmondo referenced was, it was actually, I was watching a Motor Trend, and there was a video about like the greatest mysteries in like vehicle crashes, and
Mhm.
they did a documentary on the Ferrari crash and Stefan Ericsson, and they all of a sudden brought up the freaking the Gizmondo, and I was like, oh man, hey, I know that.
What a crazy like world we live in.
Yeah, but anyway, so I guess getting back to 3DO now. So overall, like looking at the system, like spec wise, it was one of the first like really to go with like CDs as the main format. It
Mhm.
was designed with 3D in mind, even though objectively it wasn't very good at 3D, which I'll get into in later episodes.
That seems to be a
Uh,
thing with a lot of these early 3D consoles, with the exception of like the PS1.
yeah, which is funny because so the 3DO is like what I call part of like one of those like like in between generations where it's technically
Mhm.
it's technically a fifth generation console, but it came out before the fifth generation really started with like the PlayStation and Saturn. So it was kind of like um, it was like this kind of halfway generation where you had the 3DO and the Jaguar like early on, which
Mhm.
were very ahead of the curve, but at the same time really were very mismanaged and didn't really explain. They weren't ready. Basically, the world was not ready for what they had in store for gamers.
It's a lot of they walked so others could run. I know that's kind of like a played out analogy, but I really look at that with a lot of stuff like this, and not even just a 3DO. Like pretty much everything Sega did post Genesis was that it walked so that others could run, and it's a shame
Exactly.
because there's a lot of, now with that said, the 3DO was mismanaged horribly. One of the other big issues with it, like not no, this is all pre-launch, but just like in terms from the business side, is that because they weren't making any consoles in house and it was a standard, they weren't like ordering the consoles directly, they couldn't. Most consoles sell at a loss and they make it back in hardware or software sales, excuse me. To do that for the 3DO, they had to make sure the manufacturers were still guaranteed their money,
Hmm.
which normally wouldn't be an issue if you were the one selling the consoles, but you're not. So the you're selling the standard, or you're licensing the standard to another company, i.e. Gold Star, i.e. Panasonic, i.e. whatever. Then they have to go to the manufacturers and buy the part and make sure the manufacturers can make a part. So now like it just raises the cost so much. So
Hmm.
it was a cool idea, but for a game console, it was just too hard to make sure everyone could make money. And then that kind of gets
Exactly.
into like one of the reasons it failed, but it is interesting to note like that was one of its early challenges, and I'm sure there was a way they thought they could overcome it just through sales, but obviously it didn't come to fruition.
So interesting enough, like you had mentioned Gold Star. We'll be getting
Yes.
into it into a future episode, but the 3D. So essentially, 3DO was licensed to like a number of different manufacturers. Only three or four, I believe, actually made any hardware. And the most notable was obviously Panasonic, then Gold Star, and then Japan had the Sanyo version, which I think is actually
Mhm.
related to Panasonic. I believe they're actually related companies.
There was one Sanyo, you said, right? There was
That was the
one that I was going to say that turned into LG or something like that. I think,
that was Gold
or is
Star.
that was Gold Star? Okay, never mind then.
I
I
think
was for
Sanyo
some
is like a jet. Sorry, I think Sanyo is a Japanese branch of Panasonic for some reason.
okay.
Because the Sanyo was the Japanese 3DO,
Hmm.
and then the only other company that made 3DOs was the was Creative Labs, and they actually made a PC expansion card that allowed you to play 3DO games on your PC.
That's interesting. That's an interest. So they just made the expansion card. They didn't make any consoles.
No, it was just like it was a 3DO on a board that you'd plug into a PC, and then you could play the 3DO games on your PC.
That's interesting. I don't know if that's smart or not. Like, I'm genuinely not certain if that's a good idea. Like, part of it's like, well, by doing that, you kind of take out the middleman of the console manufacturers. You just manufacture this chip. It's a lot cheaper to make a chip than it is to,
Mhm.
I would assume, at the very least, to create an add-on thing. But at the same time, then you already have a PC. There are some type of computer, maybe not a PC, but like they already have some type of computer.
Mm-hmm.
So like why not just upgrade your computer instead of is it a big enough upgrade that you wouldn't have to like upgrade individual parts? You just add this add-on chip? I don't know.
Well, it
I
got
don't
more
know if
complicated.
that's a good idea or bad idea.
It also was more complicated too because you needed a specific CD drive for it to work, and
Oh jeez.
these these things are incredibly rare. I've never seen one in person. I only know about it because of a YouTube video.
That's video game history is wild. Like just some of the ideas that people thought like, yeah, let's go with this is just it blows me away. I do think it isn't it isn't sorry, I know what I want to say. I keep fumbling. It's a bummer that it didn't work out because the development behind this, like it had a lot of good people. Besides, like I said, RJ Michael, Dave Needle, who rest in peace, he passed away in 2016. Like they both worked at Amiga. They were they were the architects of the Amiga like the whole Amiga line. Like they
Hmm.
really all three of these primary people had their hands in some of the most like important parts of game history. Trip Hawkins with EA, and then RJ Michael and Dave Needle with Amiga, and
And then later
even the Atari
Epix.
Lynx to an extent.
Yep, because they later formed Epix, and then Epix was the creator of the Lynx.
Yep.
And then both of them, along with another colleague, David Morse, went on to form New Technology Group, which later was merged into 3DO as their hardware developer.
And Dave Morse also worked with them. He was the co-founder of Amiga. He also worked at he was a software manager at Epic. So once again, bringing in that Atari Lynx connection. I did find it funny looking at looking at a bit of his page. There's not a lot of information I was able to look up, though. There is a website in memory of Dave Morse from Rebull.com. Who knows? That doesn't help me at all. It's just an old website for a company that was updated recently. Anyway, sorry. He was the vice president of marketing at Tonka Toys. Isn't that
That's
weird? Like I
that
always
is like
the toy connection with the game industry in the early days is fascinating to me because I believe Sega worked with Tonka initially in the US to help market the Master System.
they did, and then
And
after
it's
that,
just sorry, what?
I was going to say they did, and after that failed, they Sega established Sega of America to handle the American side of things.
Mm-hmm. It's so wild. Like Tonka has all these connections into the game industry that you really wouldn't expect for a toy manufacturer that you know of as just yellow trucks.
Yeah, and being nearly indestructible.
Tonka tough, baby.
But so, anyways, continuing on now. So the hype for the 3DO was pretty real at the time. Like it was actually Time Magazine's product of the year that year. all the ads like hyped it up as like this was like the next like this was like the next like big thing in gaming. Like this was the future. I always remember one ad in particular. Like this was at the height of like the video game slander ads, where it started off with just throwing. It's actually the ending theme I use for the podcast. It's just this person throwing a Genesis and Sega CD and a Super Nintendo into a toy chest and being like, "Are you guys still playing with your toys?" or something like that.
What a dismissive piece of poo.
But it was crazy how like this thing had everything it seemed like it needed to like succeed. Like this was going to be the next like the future of gaming, and then everything just went so wrong so fast.
It's wild to me that like we said, it had a really good pedigree leading into it with all these crazy well-known individuals in the computer and gaming sphere. You had, I mean, like Trip Hawkins helped create one of the most successful companies of all time. Granted, now they're one of the most hated companies of all time, but that's not his fault. He left way before they became one of the most hated companies of all time. And he started that, and the other guys started Amiga, and then they all come together. Like on paper, this should work, and the idea of selling it as a standard wasn't necessarily a bad idea either. It was just more or less because of that middleman, it really screwed everything over. Um, and they announced a lot of stuff for it that unfortunately never really came to fruition. I mean, and I think this is okay to talk about here. If it's not, let me know. I can stop going into it. But there was a lot of talk about like ideas of what they were going to do for like with the console, like things that they planned on coming to the console. And one of the things was online service. They used, I believe they advertised the game, the console with that in mind. They also kind of wanted it to be like a set top box, kind of like what the Xbox One tried to do
Yeah.
in a sense. Yeah, Trip Hawkins claimed the console was compatible with HGTV, which I don't I don't understand how it's possible, because there wasn't really consumer grade HGTVs back then. I don't know if there was even professional ones. The term I literally clicked on the term. I googled the term just to and see what the Wikipedia entry says for it. It's been used since 1936, so it's not a new term. But I genuinely don't know what that means from a technical level. I understand 720p is considered high definition, but where in the history of consumer electronics did that become available except for like the mid 2000s?
I think it might have been like somewhat of like a misconception on his part, because the system output wise, like it has one thing that's really fascinating about it is because it's such it's like a non-standard console in a lot of ways. It actually
Yeah.
has like completely it doesn't have like proprietary cables or connectors, so you can just grab any off the shelf composite or S video that was actually built into it, S video cables, and just plug them right into the TV into the console without needing to buy a special cable.
What, no RGB? Not that many American consumer televisions could handle an RGB signal, but
No, it was cool, and it was ahead of its time. And I think one of the coolest, like fascinating things was it. So this is actually, it's both confusing and fascinating. Was the system is fully known as the 3DO interactive multiplayer system. But if you look at
what
a
a weird
3DO,
name.
yeah, if you look at a 3DO like from the front, you'll notice really quick it only has one controller port. And one of the most bizarre, and we've never seen this again, is how multiplayer worked, where the controller port for player 2 was built into the first player controller. And
Why would you daisy chain this?
I know, right? And you just daisy chain. I think you could do up to 6 controllers, which is really amazing because, like, when you think about it, the console has enough power to power like 6 different controllers all through one cable. Actually, I think it might have been 8 controllers now that I think about it.
It could go up to 8. I think daisy chaining technology, it doesn't work out well usually. It just becomes a mess of wires. That's how I used to hook up all my consoles. I would have like I wanted back when I was a kid, I would daisy chain all the AV connectors together to one TV so I could get
Hmm.
everything going into one TV. Little did I know that usually isn't the smartest idea because the signal just degrades so much
Yes.
unless you have something to boost the signal. So I would have, how did I do it? I had a VCR in my game room, and what I did was how did I do this? I hooked up the VCR to the well, I mean, back in the day, I had a VCR, I should say. I hooked up the VCR to the TV through the the coaxial cable, and then into the to the video in, like the cable in coaxial on the back of the VCR. I had plugged in, I want to say like my Sega Genesis or something because I didn't have AV cables for it at the time or something like that. And
Hmm.
then in or maybe it was the Sega Master System because this was back when I still had my game room all set up in my parents' house, and then plugged into the Sega Master System was like the Sega Genesis then or something like that. Like I just daisy chained the coaxial cables to each of them because they have that AV in because you could I mean it was a smart thing. You could hook up your cable through that thing so that way you could have your console set up and your cable set up all at the same time. It was smart, but it's not good for daisy chaining. I think and I've never seen this connector before. I had an AV connector that plugged into the coaxial back, the cable on the back, and it was one cord, but it had three heads. That one went to the PlayStation, the other went to the 64, and the other went to the Dreamcast. So technically, I could have them all up at once, but I didn't have a Dreamcast as a kid. Anyway, sorry that was a side tangent. I just find daisy chaining stuff bizarrely amusing just from those personal experiences.
It's the
Um,
funniest thing ever, especially with controllers,
yeah,
because like
yeah,
one thing that that's really fun to point out is like if you were in a if you were say the first player and you were player two was like say like was beating you pretty bad, you could just unplug their controller
you're
because
not
it was
what a and no imagine though imagine player two is beating you real bad, but there are daisy chained to player three, four, five, and six. So you just unplug player twos and everyone's gone.
yep.
Every
Everyone's
single person's gone. As soon as one connection gives, they're all fucked.
yep.
Sorry. As soon as one connection gives, they're all screwed.
Yeah, it's just it's such a cool idea, but at the same time it's like why? Like this is so stupid. Like you could have I guess actually my theory is I feel like it had to do with the manufacturing because it was easier to have a standardized manufacturing
That's
layout.
true. It probably also cut down on the cost of the console because you wouldn't have to add multiple ports to the
Hmm.
console. You could just add the port to the controller. That makes a lot of sense, actually. It probably cut down on the cost of manufacturing.
And what's interesting is you can actually mix and match controllers between the different brands because I actually personally own a Panasonic and a Gold Star controller, and they both function perfectly fine on the system.
That's pretty interesting. Um, there was some other stuff that I thought was that I thought was kind of cool. It never came to fruition. Once again, they wanted to they were hoping that because they could turn this into a set top box that it would appeal to cable companies, and then they could turn that into like some type of hub for digital services, like whether it was on demand video or um I'm trying to think of some other options that it could be. On demand video is the only thing that's coming to my head right now, but or just like digital, it could just be interactive services like online services as well, digital interactive services, i.e. like the Sega channel maybe or something along those
Hmm.
lines. So who knows, it had a lot of ambitious ideas, but really what it boils down to, like it even now it would kill it now, that $700
Oh
price
yeah,
point.
I will keep in mind that that was just for the Panasonic FC1 model. I believe the Gold Star was cheaper, but
Okay, good to know.
The Gold Star also came out a little bit after the Panasonic, the FC1 Panasonic.
That would make sense because the Korean launch was almost over a year later from the North American one. And it's is if Gold Star is, I believe I remember you saying on the original episode it was a Korean company. So that would make sense why it didn't quite show up right away.
Mm. And also in terms of build quality, like this is, I guess, a sneak peek for a future episode. I don't want to get too far into, but the quality between the consoles was not exactly like 100% the same. Like the Panasonics are generally considered like the highest quality ones, particularly the
Yeah.
FC1 model. The Gold Stars have been notorious for their more the cheaper end and tend to fail more often, which was kind of an interesting thing because, like you were saying, that $700 price tag literally like was like the nail in the coffin for any chance this thing had.
I mean, look at happened to the PS3 even. Like I know it I think what is worth noting about this series you're doing too is like as much as we are focusing on the 3DO, you can look at its blunders and compare it to blunders of modern day or more modern day, considering the PS3 is quickly approaching 20 years old, which is terrifying and really I just feel very old thinking about that.
Mm.
It's only PS3 is only 4 years away from being 20. It's 16 right now. That's nuts.
And
Uh,
it's at the point where it's considered a retro console now, which is even more nuts. But
yep. Yep. Even though there are games that were released less than 10 years ago for the system.
mm,
Last of Us still feels like anyway, that's a digression. What I was going to say though was with the 3DO, it's worth noting what some of its blunders were and comparing it to what modern consoles and like developers and publishers have done. I mean, just in this episode alone, the price point is very like it reminds me of the PS3, and the PS3, at launch was way too expensive. The set top box. Now it failed for different reasons, but it reminds me of the Xbox One. The idea of turning a home console into something that is the all-inclusive, the all-in-one idea of for home entertainment. And that idea technically is what multimedia was all about back in the 90s. It was all about
mm,
getting all of your entertainment in various ways, multiple ways, and all of your media in multiple formats. And that was what multimedia was. Just like the Xbox One tried to be the hub for all of your media, for cable, for online, for all that stuff. And the Xbox One, I had a better chance of succeeding than the 3DO ever did in the era that they were both released, mainly just because things were already going towards an online only thing. Or I shouldn't say only, God forbid that, in my opinion. But anyway, going towards online, a lot more heavily online
mm,
reliant. And then the 3DO, it didn't like that infrastructure wasn't really there. There was no slow like there's been a slow building of an ecosystem to be able to have what we have now in terms of what the digital offerings are for these console manufacturers. Back then there was no ecosystem built in place. The gaming this was a gaming system that was marketed for adults, by and large for adults, for an era that the game market crashed in North America obviously in 83. And so 10 years of it being designed towards kids, and only less than that if you count when the NES actually came out in North America in like what 85, and even that was just a small market. So really it wasn't full speed until 88, and that's you only have 5 years. You don't have an ecosystem set up in 5 years. It
mm,
took literally, if you look at where we are right now, it took over 30 years of building up a gaming ecosystem just to get where we are now, to have people comfortable with what it is.
mm.
I mean, hell, look at Steam was kind of like a, not necessarily like this, they didn't create its own home console, but they had their own proprietary thing, and it took years before it really took off.
Oh yeah.
And now obviously now it's huge, but it's just, this console really seems to have tried a lot of different things that newer consoles and newer companies have tried, and they did a poor job of it. But I think it's worth noting all the things leading up to it, Because this isn't even talking about the launch of the 3DO or even like what the software for the 3DO was. We're focusing specifically on the things they promised leading up to it to promote it and whatnot. And a lot of the promotions sound eerily similar to things we have heard within the last 10, 15 years.
Oh yeah, it's very interesting looking at a lot of these things because you can gaming. I always say goes through like weird cycles where like certain things like they come back every now and then. Like
Yes.
the multimedia thing is still something that obviously we've seen with Microsoft is with the Xbox One. It's still something that gaming wants to be, but gaming companies I still don't believe truly understand gamers themselves because
Not
gamers have
all of
always
them.
yeah because gamers
I
are
mean, not
really
all companies. Sorry,
yeah
I keep cutting you off.
no that's okay but what I said was like gaming gamers themselves are a strange kind of breed because we all have our own different perspectives on a lot of things. That's why like the console wars are a thing. Because if all gamers thought the same, there'd be no competition, and then we'd have honestly, I don't think there'd be a lot of innovation either at the same time.
I agree with you on that. I do think gamers don't actually know what they want, and I put
No, they really
myself
don't.
in that category very much so. Like there's games that I'll try that I don't here's actually a good example. Dark Souls. I'm not a huge fan of the game. Not because of anything the game did specifically. I tried it out. I played like 10, 15 hours of the first Dark Souls, and I just it's one of those things when a genre of games or a series of games gets its head too stuck up its own butt in the gamer's mind, they think they know what they want from a series. Dark Souls, people always talk about how they just want it has, it's known to be hard. And, like if it's not hard, then it's like, no, accessibility options are for babies with these. And, there's that constant conversation in the toxic fan base that surrounds that series, not the entire fan base, just the toxic half,
Mhm.
around that type of thing, around that type of, um, around that game, excuse me. And I don't think they really know what they want. Like I mean that not in even in a mean way. Like you're not dumb that you don't know what you want. I feel like it's one of those things like you don't realize what all goes into game design, so you don't really know what you like. Like you like certain things, and maybe specific genres, and you have a cursory knowledge of game design or whatnot because you've played a lot of games. But I feel like most people don't really know what they like just because like that's otherwise you're never surprised, and that's the worst thing. Like especially as an adult gamer, like you lose that sense of wonder. Like as a kid, like the first time you probably I don't know I don't know about you, Bill, but like one of the first things that like blew me away as a kid, like completely captured my imagination, was playing Mario 3 for the first time. And I didn't own an NES, but I remember being at a friend's house. And we were playing down in their basement. They had like a finished basement, so they had like a pool table, and they actually had a separate computer room for the family where he would, or the one guy, or the one kid would go on instant AOL Instant Messenger and message all his girlfriends and whatnot. Uh, but I remember this was before this memory. This was before this memory, and we were down there. We were playing Mario 3, and to me it was a cartoon that you controlled, and you'll never be able to get that feeling back ever
Mhm.
because it's the wonder of a kid. You don't know anything, so whenever you see something like that, you're like, "Whoa, this is a cartoon I can control. This exists." Like you don't get that same feeling, and like as you get older and you start experiencing more games and games mean something to you, whether it's through the narrative or whether it's the gameplay or this and that, like you don't really know what you're looking for anymore because you don't know what's going to get you that sense of wonder, that sense of like the unknown, something that you weren't expecting to happen. um and I feel like gamers don't know what they want, so how can developers know what they really want? And
Exactly.
to as like a ham-fisted way to bring this back to the 3DO, like what is a multimedia system? Like what do you do to make something multimedia? Their idea of it was, it can play your movie CDs, and it can show pictures and slideshows, and it can play music. It can play your music CDs, and then of course it can play games with live action video, which The technology really wasn't there to do it efficiently. I would say only recently I've seen some decent live action games. There's a game called Erica that I played somewhat recently in the last year or two, which was really good. But it, people don't know what they want. So how can console manufacturers know what they want?
Exactly. But I guess so. Now to wrap it up, to get into the launch of the system itself. So the 3DO officially launched in 1993, and the system got a lot of, like, obviously we brought up a lot of like media attention and praise. Like, a lot of people were claiming it was going to be the next big thing. And like
Hmm.
during the run up, they actually advertised a ton of games for it that looked really like fascinating at the time. Like big ones like Return Fire, which was kind of like the killer app for the system, depending on who you'd ask, or Road Rash, because Trip Hawkins' connection to EA was in some ways like a first party developer for the system in an interesting way, because there was also FIFA International Soccer, and then
Hmm.
Jurassic Park Interactive, which was kind of like the stinker of those bunch. But due to like somewhat of the kind of rushed launch, because the 3DO's launch was a bit like kind of pushed ahead quicker than I guess the developers were actually ready for. None of the games were actually ready, and the only game that was available at launch was a little known title at the time called Crash and Burn, developed by a, a little known developer that would later be known as Crystal Dynamics.
Oh, just a small developer.
Yeah, they had their humble beginnings, you could say.
I mean, Naughty Dog too,
Yep.
even though it
Yeah.
wasn't their first game.
It's the first. It was the first game in the Universal deal, though.
Yes, yes, it was. I might have been their first game under the Naughty Dog moniker. I can't remember anymore. I did a
Uh,
series. Actually, shout out to my series. I did a series on the history of Naughty Dog where I talked about the two co-founders. I did an episode on one of the co-founders. I did a second episode on another of the co-founders, and I did a third episode on just kind of like a general history of Naughty Dog. And they, I forget what, I don't remember when the first time they created a game under the Naughty Dog moniker, but they were called Jam Software, Jason
yeah,
and Andy's Magic.
I believe not. Well, because they did that Genesis like RPG under Naughty Dog as well.
Okay, that was
Rings of Power.
Rings
Rings
of
of
Power.
Power.
Yeah.
Yep. So I think it was they had done a couple games under Naughty Dog, but it was the last game before Crash was Way of the Warrior.
Hmm.
Insomniac was making a game for the 3DO too.
Really, what were they making?
They were making Disruptor, but they ended up the
Which
three.
came out on the PS1 then.
Yep, because the 3DO was they. I think I saw an interview like Ted Price basically said the 3DO was going nowhere, and the PlayStation was more powerful than anyways.
3DO was The 3DO was going nowhere. That sounds like a band name.
Yeah, but anyways, so to wrap it around now, 3DO comes out and it's at an absurd $699, which was the only way Panasonic was going to make any money off of the thing. And keep in mind too, Panasonic also made software for the system.
Did they?
Well, they didn't make it directly, but they produced it.
Okay.
They might have
Okay.
actually made they might have made a few games, but I know they definitely produced a ton of games. A lot of ports, like I know the port of Myst for the console has Panasonic's name on the cover,
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
but that was how they kind of offset some of their prices, because after 6 months at launch of really not doing a whole lot, they cut the price down to $4.99, and by then
They should have just done that from the beginning.
I know it was unfortunately they needed to make money, and they weren't going to make any money from 3DO.
I mean, did I believe the Japanese launch was semi-successful, but we should hold on that. That's for your next episode, I believe.
Yeah, talking about the different variations. And it was basically, I guess, in a final wraparound way, it was very clear that this was not going to be it was not going to be the taking the world by storm like a lot of people said it would be, which is really interesting because in a lot of ways, like, to go into the future, in a lot of ways, like what the 3DO wanted to be is in a lot of ways what the PlayStation ended up being.
Yeah,
Like
kind of,
this,
because the PS1 could play music. It didn't really like technically you could have videos on it, but it was, the operating system didn't really support that. The system could have, but the operating system didn't. You couldn't put in like a movie CD or whatever and
No.
watch a movie CD on a PS1. um I don't think you could look at picture CDs either, but you could play regular CDs on it. I always like, this is a very quick side tangent. I always like that some PS1 games you could stick in a CD player and play the soundtrack from the
Hmm.
game right on it. I always found that kind of cool.
That was a cool touch that they did back in the day.
Yeah, you don't
Another,
really see that. You can't stick a Blu-ray disc into a CD and have it work.
yeah. No. What's funny though is another side thing is the 3DO is one of the last consoles to be released with the 0 region locking. In a sense, you could play basically any game released for it. There also, I don't think it had copy protection,
If it's not region locked, I doubt it has copy protection.
and I don't think there actually was like a license. Like I think the licensing was so loose that like literally anybody could make a game for 3DO, and like they did not care in the slightest. Because believe it or not,
Like, no, finish what you're saying.
well, it was like believe it or not, in Japan the system was known for its erotic games because it was the only console.
Yeah.
Because it was the only console that they could release them on.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of just reminds me of like back in the the Atari days where there was no, like, licensing was not a thing, and you could just do whatever you wanted. And
Mm.
like there was a lot of erotic games for the 3DO in Japan. There's a handful of pornographic games for the Atari, which combination of just bad gameplay and really racist moments.
Oh yeah,
We'll
I'd
leave
say
it
it
at
was
that. That's a story for another day.
yeah. Which is funny too, because in hindsight, the Xbox 360 carried that niche in Japan for a while.
Oh, really?
Because it wasn't popular, no one cared about it, so they just threw all that crap on the 360.
Might as well. Might as well. It makes sense. Microsoft has always has a hard time selling. Any non-Japanese console has a hard time selling in Japan.
Yeah, I'm curious how this generation's a little side note. I'm actually curious how this generation's going to go, just because Sony's having a hard time getting those things out.
Yeah, but the Switch is eating everyone's lunch over there, so it's probably not like
Yeah.
That's a different discussion for a different day. We could keep going off on tangents. We're both, hardcore gamers, so we could keep off finding these tangents to go on to.
Yeah. But anyways, yeah, so that's kind of where I wanted to leave off, just with the launch itself, not getting into anything further than that. Is there any final remarks you wanted to have?
I mean, we've pretty much covered it. I feel like I rambled more than offered anything useful to the conversation. Hopefully, I was at least somewhat entertaining, and that I pointed out that amazing picture of Trip Hawkins from 2019, where he looks like the bad guy from Mr. Nice Guy.
Yeah.
But in any case, the 3DO, the reason I messaged you saying like, hey, if you ever need someone on an episode, I'd love to join, is just because I like this type of thing. I like that there's focuses on niche topics like this in the gaming sphere, where you don't see that often enough. In a world of just a lot of news podcasts and retrospective podcasts or whatever, there is, I put myself in the retrospective camp to a degree there. It's, you don't see a lot of like dives into some of the lesser known aspects of game history. And as much as the 3DO it was a flop, it at least was interesting and at least tried something new. They took a risk. It wasn't necessarily a cynical risk. And I kind of, I mean, it's, almost 30 years too late, but I almost want to like reward it. Like this show kind of feels like a reward to them for like, yeah, you actually tried something different. You tried to bring something new to the consumers, and it just failed, and that sucks. And it's a bummer that it happened, but like, I feel like you don't see that enough anymore. Like, though I will say the new, what is it? The company Panic made that new, oh my gosh, it's got the hand crank Playdate, the Playdate.
Yep.
That thing looks freaking cool. And I love that they're taking a risk on something like that. Just something that's different, trying to provide a new experience to people. And that's what the 3DO did. It flopped, but I think it's worth looking at for A, looking at why it failed, B, looking at what it did well, and C, it's just interesting. It's an interesting story to see how did this all come together and how did it fail.
Yeah. Like, I always thought it was like the most fascinating console in like the history of gaming that no one talks about, but is also like, it's interesting because there's literally no reason to really play a 3DO anymore. But at the same time, you're kind of fascinated by it and you want to try it out in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I would love to have a 3DO. I don't have one. Same with like it's like its weird cousin, the CDI, which is, it's a different story, different story for a different day, but it just it's just wild to me that two consoles that focused on multimedia came out around the same time. I mean, in the middle of the 1990s multimedia craze, but still, or let me rephrase it, in the middle of the 90s multimedia craze, but it still is funny to me. And I think that it's worth looking into. It's worth investigating and having your own way to experience the 3DO.
Yeah, that's honestly about it for this one. Would you like to plug your stuff one more time, or?
Sure. Still Loading podcast. I'm not going to go into spiel of all the things that it is. You heard that at the beginning of the show. If that interests you, check it out. You can find it on Facebook, Twitter. Oh, well, I was about to get my social media. My social media is at Still Loading Pod on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you want to listen to the show, it's on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, other places. It's wherever good podcasts are sold for free. So go check it out there.
All right. And thanks again, Josh, for joining me on this one. You can also find me on the Gaming and Collecting podcast, which is my normal podcast where me and my sister Alex discuss our large variety of gaming and anime-related topics. And the 3DO experience can be found on all your major podcasting platforms, and we will see you guys all next time.
Bye.
If you're not playing on a 3DO system, what are you playing with?